In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, a 78-year-old widow was about to discover that family could be more dangerous than strangers. What started as a simple Tuesday morning dusting routine took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her daughter-in-law's true nature. Helen Green wasn't your typical helpless elderly woman. For 47 years, she had spent her life as a devoted wife and mother, known for her fierce determination and unwavering loyalty to family. When she encountered Margaret's explosive rage that ordinary Tuesday, she had no idea she was walking into a carefully orchestrated campaign of financial exploitation and psychological abuse. Helen's discovery of hidden documents in her own attic would lead to a legal battle that would expose years of systematic theft and manipulation. What began as a vulnerable widow seeking shelter with her son would become a masterclass in reclaiming power at any age. The Green family would never be the same after Helen remembered who she truly was beneath years of manufactured helplessness. This is the story of how a woman who seemed to have nothing left discovered she had everything she needed to fight back, and how sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up destroying themselves instead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You know that moment when you realize your entire life has become a lie? When the people you birthed, raised, and sacrificed everything for look you straight in the eye and tell you you're worthless? I'm 78 years old, and I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I was wrong. My name is Helen Green, and this is the story of how I discovered that sometimes the cruelest prisons are built by the hands of those we love most. But more importantly, this is the story of how I found the key to my own freedom, hidden in the very place they never thought to look. The morning light filters through the thin curtains of what used to be my grandson's bedroom, casting long shadows across the cramped space that has become my world. The single bed creaks beneath me as I shift, my arthritic joints protesting against another night on a mattress that's seen better decades. The walls are still decorated with faded superhero posters, a cruel reminder that this room was never meant for someone like me. Someone old. Someone forgotten. I can hear them downstairs already, my son Jack and his wife Margaret, their voices carrying that particular tone they reserve for discussions about me. Not with me, mind you. About me. As if I'm some sort of inconvenient furniture that needs to be moved or disposed of. I strain to listen, though I know I shouldn't. Nothing good ever comes from eavesdropping on conversations about yourself, especially when you're the subject everyone wishes would simply disappear. She's getting worse. Margaret's voice drifts up through the thin floor. My daughter-in-law. The one who used to smile so sweetly when she first married Jack, who used to call me Mom with what I thought was genuine affection. Now her voice carries nothing but irritation when she speaks of me. The doctor said it's normal aging, Jack responds, his tone dismissive. My son, my firstborn, the one who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them the most beautiful flowers in the world. The one who became a successful lawyer because I worked 3 jobs to put him through college. We just have to deal with it. Deal with it. Deal with me. That's what I've become in their eyes. A problem to be managed, rather than a mother to be loved. I pull my worn robe tighter around my shoulders and reach for my walking cane, the one with the carved handle that my late husband Thomas gave me for my 70th birthday. It was supposed to be a joke then, something we laughed about together. For, when you're really old and need help getting around, he had said with that mischievous grin of his. Neither of us imagined that 8 years later, it would become both my lifeline and my torment. The stairs creak under my careful descent, each step a small negotiation between my will and my aging body. I've learned to time these morning journeys perfectly, arriving in the kitchen just as Jack finishes his coffee and Margaret packs the last of the children's lunches. It's a delicate dance, inserting myself into their routine without causing too much disruption, without reminding them too obviously of my presence in their carefully ordered lives. Good morning. I offer quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. I've learned to make myself small, unobtrusive. Mice make less noise than I do these days, and they get treated with more consideration. Jack doesn't look up from his phone, scrolling through what I assume are important lawyer things that are far more pressing than acknowledging his mother. Margaret glances at me with the kind of look you might give a stray cat that's wandered into your kitchen. A mixture of annoyance and resignation. There's cereal in the cabinet, Margaret says without warmth, not bothering to pause in her lunch-packing routine. The cheap stuff. We're trying to cut expenses. The cheap stuff. I nod and shuffle toward the cabinet, though we both know the cheap cereal isn't about cutting expenses. It's about reminding me of my place in this household, about making sure I understand that I'm here on their charity, their sufferance. Every small indignity is carefully calculated, designed to erode whatever dignity I might still possess. I pour the generic cornflakes into a chipped bowl, add milk that's a day past its expiration, and sit at the far end of the kitchen table where I won't be in anyone's way. The cereal tastes like cardboard, but I eat it anyway because refusing would only give them another reason to lecture me about being difficult, ungrateful, a burden they can barely manage to bear. Mom's appointment is at 2, Jack says to Margaret, still not acknowledging that I'm sitting right here, that I'm perfectly capable of remembering my own medical appointments. Can you take her, or do I need to reschedule my deposition? I have parent-teacher conferences all afternoon, Margaret replies with an exaggerated sigh. Can't she take a taxi or something? They're talking about me as if I'm not here, as if I'm some sort of complicated logistics problem rather than a human being who raised them both, who changed their diapers and sat up with them through countless sick nights and celebrated every small triumph of their childhood. I want to speak up, to remind them that I'm sitting right here, that I have ears and feelings and a voice of my own, but I've learned that speaking up only makes things worse. Fine, Jack snaps, finally looking at me with undisguised irritation. But you need to be ready at 1:30 sharp. I'm not waiting around if you're not ready. I nod obediently, keeping my eyes fixed on my cereal bowl. 1:30 sharp, as if I have anywhere else to be, anything else to do with my time, as if my entire existence doesn't revolve around their schedules, their convenience, their barely concealed resentment at having to care for the woman who gave them life. The sound of children's footsteps thunders down the stairs, my grandchildren racing through the kitchen like small tornadoes. Emma, 12, with her mother's sharp features and dismissive attitude. Michael, 10, who still sometimes looks at me with something approaching curiosity before remembering that I'm not worth his attention. They grab their lunches and backpacks without so much as glancing in my direction, as if I'm part of the furniture, as invisible as the kitchen table or the refrigerator. "Bye, Mom," they call to Margaret, completely ignoring my presence. I remember when they were babies, how they used to reach for me with chubby fingers, how Emma used to insist I read her bedtime stories in funny voices, how Michael used to bring me his scraped knees for grandmotherly kisses and Band-Aids. Now they look through me as if I don't exist, trained by their parents to see me as irrelevant, as background noise in their busy lives. The house empties quickly after that, leaving me alone with the echoing silence and the weight of my own irrelevance. This is my life now. These long stretches of solitude punctuated by moments of casual cruelty, days that blend together in an endless stream of small humiliations and quiet desperation. I sit at that kitchen table for what feels like hours, staring at the remnants of my cardboard breakfast, thinking about Thomas. He used to make me feel like I mattered, like my voice had value, like I was more than just an inconvenience taking up space in someone else's life. When he held my hand, I felt anchored to something real, something that couldn't be diminished by cruel words or dismissive glances. "You're stronger than you know, Helen," he used to tell me when I doubted myself. "Don't let anyone make you. Forget that." But I had forgotten. Somewhere along the way, in the months and years after his death, I had let them convince me that I was nothing more than a burden, a problem to be solved, a responsibility they resented having to bear. The afternoon doctor's appointment passes in a blur of waiting rooms and perfunctory examinations. Jack sits in the corner, tapping on his phone, sighing audibly whenever the doctor asks me questions directly. When the doctor suggests physical therapy for my arthritis, Jack immediately jumps in. Is that really necessary? I mean, at her age? At her age. As if I'm some sort of expired product past its useful life. As if investing in my health and mobility is a waste of resources better spent elsewhere. Physical therapy could really help with her pain management and independence, the doctor explains patiently. Independence, Jack mutters under his breath, as if the very concept is ridiculous when applied to me. On the drive home, the silence in the car is suffocating. I want to ask him about the physical therapy, want to express my own opinion about my healthcare, but I've learned that my wants and opinions are unwelcome intrusions into their decision-making process. That evening, dinner is a particularly brutal affair. Margaret has prepared a beautiful meal, roast chicken with herbs, roasted vegetables, fresh bread that fills the house with warmth and comfort. But there's only enough for 4 place settings. 4, as if I don't exist, as if I don't need nourishment like everyone else. There's leftover pasta in the fridge, Margaret says without looking at me, her tone making it clear that this isn't an oversight but a deliberate choice. I heat up the cold pasta in the microwave, adding a bit of butter and salt to try to make it palatable, and eat my solitary meal while they enjoy their feast. The children chatter about their school day, Jack discusses his cases, Margaret talks about her volunteer work at the country club. I might as well be invisible. After dinner, I offer to help with the dishes, but Margaret waves me away with barely concealed impatience. You'll just be in the way, she says, not even trying to soften the rejection. So I retreat to my room, to the faded superhero posters and the creaking bed, to the isolation that has become my constant companion. I pull out an old photo album, one of the few personal items I was allowed to keep when I moved into this house after Thomas died. There we are, Thomas and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful and so deeply in love. There's Jack as a baby, chubby-cheeked and reaching for the camera with pure joy. There are Christmas mornings and birthday parties and family vacations, all the moments that made up a life I thought was built on love and mutual care. How did it all go so wrong? How did the son who used to crawl into my lap during thunderstorms become a man who can't stand to be in the same room with me? How did the life I built with such hope and dedication become this prison of loneliness and rejection? I close the album and stare out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, other families are gathering around dinner tables, sharing their days, supporting each other through life's challenges. Other mothers are being valued for their wisdom, cherished for their sacrifices, loved for who they are rather than resented for what they need. But not me. I'm the inconvenience, the burden, the problem that needs to be managed and minimized and endured. As I prepare for bed, I catch a glimpse of myself in the small mirror above the dresser. When did I become so small? When did my shoulders develop this permanent hunch of defeat? When did my face begin to wear this expression of constant apology for simply existing? Thomas wouldn't recognize me now. The woman he loved, the woman he called his fierce little warrior, when I stood up to his difficult mother or fought for our children's futures. That woman has disappeared, replaced by this ghost who apologizes for breathing. But as I lie down on the lumpy mattress, something small and hard inside, my chest refuses to completely surrender. Maybe it's Thomas's voice echoing in my memory, or maybe it's just the stubborn remnant of who I used to be. Whatever it is, it whispers that this isn't how the story has to end. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I know I can't continue like this forever. Something has to change, even if I don't yet know what or how. The breaking point came. On a Tuesday, ordinary as rain. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there, scattered like breadcrumbs through the preceding weeks. Margaret's comments had grown sharper, her patience thinner. Jack's irritation with my mere presence had reached a fever pitch that made the air itself feel toxic whenever he walked into a room. But somehow, I still wasn't prepared for the moment when everything I thought I knew about my place in this family shattered like glass against concrete. It started with something so small, so insignificant, that later I would marvel at how the most devastating moments often spring from the most trivial causes. I had been dusting the living room, something I did every Tuesday morning, a routine I maintained partly out of habit and partly out of a desperate need to feel useful, to justify my existence in this house where I was barely tolerated. Margaret had been on the phone with one of her country club friends, her voice carrying that particular tone of superiority she used when discussing her charitable work or her children's achievements. I tried to stay invisible, moving quietly around the furniture, careful not to disturb her conversation. "Oh, you know how it is with elderly parents," she was saying, her back to me as she gazed out the front window. "They become so dependent, so needy. It's like having another child, except children eventually grow up and become independent." I froze, my dust cloth suspended mid-wipe on the coffee table. She was talking about me, again, to her friends, discussing my inadequacies and dependencies as if I were some sort of interesting case study, rather than the woman who had welcomed her into this family with open arms. No, Jack's been wonderful about it," she continued, and I could hear the smile in her voice, the performance of the dutiful daughter-in-law. So patient and understanding. But it's taking a toll, on our marriage, on the children. Sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't be better for everyone if she were in a facility. A facility. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grip the edge of the coffee table to steady myself. They were discussing putting me in a home, disposing of me like unwanted furniture, and I was hearing about it secondhand through Margaret's gossip session. I must have made some small sound, a gasp, a whimper, some involuntary expression of the pain that was tearing through my chest, because Margaret suddenly turned around, her eyes narrowing as she took in my presence. "I'll have to call you." "Back, Susan," she said into the phone, her voice never losing its pleasant tone even as her gaze fixed on me with something approaching hatred. "Yes, I'll talk to you soon." She hung up the phone and we stood there, staring at each other across the living room that had become a battlefield. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken accusations and long-suppressed resentments. "How long were you standing there?" she asked, her voice deceptively calm. "I was just dusting," I whispered, holding up the cloth as if it could somehow explain away what I'd overheard, as if it could undo the words that had already lodged themselves like splinters in my heart. "Eavesdropping, you mean?" Her tone was ice-cold now, all pretense of civility dropped. How typical. Sneaking around, listening to private conversations. "Don't you have any shame?" "I wasn't sneaking," I said, my voice barely audible. "I was just..." "You were just what? Spying? Gathering ammunition for your next guilt trip? Your next pathetic attempt to make us feel sorry for you?" The cruelty in her words was breathtaking, but it was the look in her eyes that truly terrified me. There was no mask now, no performance of tolerance or patience, just pure, undiluted contempt for my existence. "Margaret, please," I began, but she cut me off with a harsh laugh. "Please what? Please pretend that you're not a burden? Please pretend that having you here isn't destroying our family? Please pretend that you haven't outstayed your welcome by about 3 years?" Each word was a slap, delivered with the precision of someone who had been cataloging my failures and inadequacies for years, storing them up for exactly this moment. "I try not to be a burden," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "I try to help, to stay out of the way." Help? Margaret's voice rose, and I could see the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiling over. You call what you do helping? You break more dishes than you wash. You can barely. Remember to take your medications. You shuffle around this house like some sort of ghost, making everyone uncomfortable with your neediness and your constant presence. This is my son's house, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Jack asked me to come here. After Thomas died, he said. Jack said a lot of things, Margaret snapped. Jack felt guilty about his father's death, guilty that he hadn't been around more when Thomas was sick. But guilt is a luxury we can't afford anymore. This family can't continue to revolve around your needs. I don't ask for much, I protested. But even as I said it, I could hear how weak it sounded, how pathetic. You don't ask for much? Margaret stepped closer, and I instinctively backed away, bumping into the coffee table. You don't ask for much? You ask for everything, Helen. You ask for us to reorganize our entire lives around your limitations. You ask for us to pretend that having you here is some sort of blessing instead of the nightmare it actually is. That's not true, I whispered. But my voice lacked conviction. Maybe it was true. Maybe I had been blind to the ways I was disrupting their lives, imposing on their patience and goodwill. Isn't it? Margaret's smile was sharp as a blade. When was the last time Jack and I had a moment alone together? When was the last time we could take a family vacation without worrying about what to do with you? When was the last time we could have friends over without having to explain why there's an old woman shuffling around in the background? The words kept coming, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage, to strip away whatever dignity I had left. And I stood there and took it, as I had been taking it for months, because some part of me believed that I deserved it, that she was only saying out loud what everyone else was thinking. You want to know the truth, Helen? The real truth? Margaret was standing directly in front of me now, her voice low and venomous. We're all just waiting for you to die, waiting for this nightmare to be over so we can get on with our lives. The shock of those words, the sheer, brutal honesty of them, left me speechless. I stared at her, my mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to process what I'd just heard. What? Nothing to say? No guilt trip about all the sacrifices you made for Jack? No sob story about how lonely you are, how much you— Miss Thomas? I tried to speak, tried to defend myself, but no words came. The magnitude of her hatred, the depth of her resentment, had left me paralyzed. That's what I thought, Margaret said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Deep down, you know I'm right. You know you're nothing but a burden, a millstone around this family's neck. And then, without warning, she shoved me. It wasn't a hard shove, not really. But I was already off balance, already weakened by the emotional assault she'd just unleashed. My cane clattered to the floor as I stumbled backward, my hip catching the corner of the coffee table before I went down hard, my knees hitting the hardwood with a crack that seemed to echo through the entire house. For a moment, neither of us moved. I lay there on the floor, stunned, the pain in my knees nothing compared to the shock of what had just happened. Margaret stood over me, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her face flushed with the aftermath of her rage. "Look at you," she said, her voice quieter now but no less cruel. "Pathetic, can't even stand up without help." I tried to push myself up, but my arms were shaking, my whole body trembling with the shock of the fall and the emotional devastation of her words. The humiliation of lying there on the floor, helpless and exposed, was almost unbearable. "Get up," Margaret said, but she made no move to help me. "Get up and go to your room. I don't want to see you for the rest of the day." Somehow, I managed to get to my hands and knees, then slowly, painfully, pulled myself upright using the couch for support. My knees were bleeding, seeping through my thin stockings, and my hip throbbed where I'd hit the table. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional wreckage Margaret had left in her wake. I retrieved my cane with shaking hands and looked at her one last time. She was already turning away, dismissing me as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience that had been dealt with and forgotten. "Margaret," I said, my voice barely a whisper. She turned back, her expression one of cold impatience. "What?" I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to tell her that I had loved her like a daughter, that I had welcomed her into our family with open arms and an open heart. I wanted to remind her of the early years, when she used to seek my advice about Jack, when she used to bring me small gifts and call me Mom with what seemed like genuine affection. Instead, I said nothing. Because standing there, bleeding and broken, I finally understood something that had taken me far too long to realize. She had never loved me. Not really. The affection had been performance, the kindness strategic. She had been waiting for years for Thomas to die, for me to become vulnerable, so she could do exactly what she had just done. I turned and walked slowly toward the stairs, each step a small agony in my protesting joints. Behind me, I could hear Margaret already dialing her phone, probably calling Susan back to finish their conversation about facilities and burdens and inconvenient elderly relatives. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at my bleeding knees. The stockings were ruined, torn and stained with blood and defeat. I should clean the wounds, should tend to the scrapes and bruises. But I couldn't seem to make myself move. This was it then. This was what my life had become. I was 78 years old, and I had been reduced to something less than human in the eyes of the people I loved most. I was a problem to be solved, a burden to be endured, an inconvenience taking up space in their perfect lives. For a long time, I just sat there as the afternoon light faded and the house settled into its evening rhythms around me. I could hear Jack come home, could hear the low murmur of Margaret's voice as she no doubt briefed him on the day's events. I wondered what version of the story she was telling, how she was spinning my presence and my needs into further evidence of my inadequacy. But as the darkness deepened outside my window, something strange began to happen. The shock and humiliation of the afternoon began to crystallize into something else, something I hadn't felt in years. Anger. Not the hot, explosive rage that had driven Margaret to push me, but something colder, more focused. A quiet, burning fury at the injustice of it all, at the way they had stripped me of my dignity and my humanity piece by piece until I barely recognized myself. I thought about Thomas, about the woman he had loved and married. That woman wouldn't have taken this abuse lying down. That woman would have fought back, would have demanded better, would have refused to accept this slow-motion destruction of everything she was and had been. Where had that woman gone? When had I allowed myself to become this cowering, apologetic ghost? The bleeding had stopped, but my knees still throbbed with each heartbeat. My hip would be bruised for weeks. But for the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't thinking about how to make myself smaller, how to be less of an inconvenience. I was thinking about how to fight back. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. My body ached from the fall, my knees stiff and tender, my hip a canvas of purple and yellow bruises. But my mind felt sharper than it had in months. The fog of self-doubt and learned helplessness that had clouded my thoughts for so long seemed to have lifted, replaced by something I barely recognized: determination. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that covered the worst of my injuries. I had no intention of giving Margaret the satisfaction of seeing the physical evidence of what she'd done, the tangible proof of how far our relationship had deteriorated. As I made my way downstairs, I could hear the familiar sounds of the morning. Routine, coffee brewing, lunches being packed, the children getting ready for school. But something was different today. I wasn't creeping down the stairs, trying to make myself invisible. I wasn't apologizing for my existence with every step. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a right to be in this house, to occupy space in this family. Margaret looked up as I entered the kitchen, her eyes immediately scanning for signs of damage, for evidence of weakness she could exploit. She found none. I had covered the scrapes on my knees with long pants and chosen a sweater that hid the worst of the bruising on my hip. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady and clear. She blinked, clearly surprised by the lack of defeat in my tone. "Morning," she replied carefully, as if testing the waters. Jack glanced up from his phone, probably wondering why the atmosphere felt different, why the usual undercurrent of tension and resentment seemed to have shifted into something else entirely. I made my breakfast in silence, but it wasn't the cowering silence of someone trying to avoid notice. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to apologize for. I poured my coffee into my favorite mug, the one with the faded flowers that Thomas had given me for our 30th anniversary, the one Margaret had been gradually pushing toward the back of the cabinet, hoping I'd forget about it. As I sat at the table, I caught Margaret watching me with narrowed eyes. She could sense the change, even if she couldn't quite identify what it was. The woman she'd pushed down yesterday, the broken creature she'd left bleeding on the living room floor, wasn't the same woman sitting across from her now. The children thundered through the kitchen as usual, grabbing their things and racing toward the door. But this time, as Emma rushed past my chair, I reached out and gently touched her arm. "Have a good day at school, sweetheart," I said softly. She stopped, startled, and looked at me as if seeing me for the first time in months. "Thanks, Grandma," she mumbled, and for just a moment, I saw a flicker of the little girl who used to climb into my lap for stories. The moment passed quickly. Margaret's sharp cough reminded Emma that acknowledging me wasn't part of the accepted routine, but it was enough. It was a crack in the wall they'd built around me, a tiny proof that I still existed as something more than an inconvenience. After the family dispersed to their various daily obligations, I found myself alone in the house with Margaret. In the past, these moments had been exercises in mutual avoidance, both of us finding reasons to be in different rooms, different parts of the house. But today, I didn't retreat to my room. I didn't make myself scarce. Instead, I sat in the living room with a book, not hiding, not apologizing, just existing in the space I had every right to occupy. Margaret bustled around, doing her usual morning tasks with an energy that seemed forced, exaggerated. I could feel her waiting for me to scurry away, to return to the shadows where she preferred me to lurk. When I didn't move, when I continued to sit calmly in my chair reading, she finally spoke. "Don't you have somewhere to be?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral but with an underlying edge. "No," I replied simply, not looking up from my book. "I don't." The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken challenges and shifting power dynamics. For months, I had been the one backing down, the one making myself small and invisible. Now, suddenly, I was claiming space, asserting my right to exist in this house without constant justification. It was around noon when I heard the knock at the door. Margaret had gone out, some volunteer commitment at the country club, and I was alone with my thoughts and my growing sense of possibility. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, I considered not answering. But something made me get up, made me walk to the door and open it. Standing on the porch was a young woman I'd seen around the neighborhood but never really spoken to. She was probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes and an open, friendly face. She was holding a casserole dish and wearing the sort of genuine smile that had become so rare in my life that I'd almost forgotten what it looked like. "Mrs. Green?" she said. "I'm Lucy Davis. I live in the blue house down the street." I nodded, unsure why she was here, what she could possibly want with me. "I know we haven't formally met," she continued, "but I've been meaning to introduce myself ever since I moved in last month. I made way too much lasagna last night, and I thought maybe you'd like some. I'm still learning to cook for one person instead of a family." The gesture was so unexpected, so genuinely kind, that for a moment I couldn't speak. When was the last time someone had thought of me as a person worth knowing, worth sharing a meal with? That's very thoughtful, I managed, stepping back to let her in. Please, come in. Lucy followed me into the kitchen, chattering easily about the neighborhood, her recent move, the challenges of starting over in a new place. Her presence filled the house with a warmth I'd forgotten was possible, a sense of normalcy that made me realize how abnormal my life had become. I have to admit, she said as I put the kettle on for tea, I was hoping you might have some advice about the best places to shop, the good restaurants, that sort of thing. You've been here longer than anyone, I imagine. It was such a simple thing, being asked for my opinion, being treated as someone who might have valuable insights to share. But it was revolutionary in the context of my current life, where my thoughts and experiences were dismissed as irrelevant. We sat at the kitchen table, and Lucy asked me about Willow Creek, about the history of the neighborhood, about my family. She listened to my answers with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions, laughing at my stories about the early days when Jack was small. You raised your son alone for a while? She asked, after I'd mentioned some of the challenges of Thomas's long work hours. Not alone, exactly, I said. But Thomas traveled a lot for work when Jack was little. It was hard sometimes, but we managed. That must have taken incredible strength, Lucy said, and there was something in her voice that made me look at her more carefully. Did you have children? I asked gently. Her face clouded for a moment. I did. A daughter. She died in a car accident 3 years ago. That's actually why I moved here. I needed a fresh start, somewhere without so many memories. The grief in her voice was raw and honest, and I felt an immediate kinship with this young woman who had suffered such an unimaginable loss. I'm so sorry, I said, reaching across the table to cover her hand with mine. Thank you, she said, blinking back tears. It's part of why I wanted to meet you, actually. I saw you in the yard sometimes, and you reminded me of my daughter's grandmother. She was such a source of strength for all of us. I guess I was hoping. Well, hoping to find some of that wisdom again. We talked for another hour, sharing stories and sorrows, finding common ground in our experiences of loss and resilience. Lucy told me about her daughter Sarah, about the joy she'd brought to their lives and the devastating emptiness her death had left behind. I found myself talking about Thomas, about the loneliness of widowhood, about the ways grief could reshape your entire understanding of yourself. But it was when Lucy asked about my current living situation that the conversation took a darker turn. Your family must be such a comfort to you, she said. Having your son and daughter-in-law close by, being able to help with the grandchildren. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to this kind stranger who had shown me more genuine warmth in 2 hours than my own family had in months. It's complicated, I said finally. Lucy's eyes sharpened, and I could see her processing the careful neutrality of my response, reading between the lines of what I wasn't saying. Complicated how? She asked gently. And suddenly, sitting across from this woman who had shared her deepest pain with me, who had treated me like a person worth knowing and listening to, I found myself telling the truth. They don't want me here, I said, the words coming out in a rush. Margaret, my daughter-in-law, she resents having to care for me. She thinks I'm a burden, an inconvenience. And Jack doesn't see it, or doesn't want to see it. Lucy leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. What do you mean, exactly? So I told her about the casual cruelties, the deliberate exclusions, the way I'd been made to feel invisible in my own family. I told her about the cheap cereal and the cold pasta, about being talked about as if I weren't there, about the constant message that I was unwanted and unloved. And then, my voice breaking, I told her about yesterday, about Margaret's words, about the push, about lying on the floor bleeding and broken while the woman who was supposed to be my daughter dismissed me like garbage. Lucy listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each revelation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd heard. "Helen," she said finally, "what Margaret did to you yesterday, that's not just cruel, it's abuse. Physical abuse." The word hit me like a slap. Abuse. I'd been thinking of it as family discord, as personality conflicts, as the inevitable friction of generations living together. But hearing Lucy name it for what it was forced me to confront the reality I'd been avoiding. "I don't know if I'd call it that," I said weakly. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they rang false. "Helen," Lucy said, her voice firm but kind, "if someone pushed you down and left you bleeding on the floor, what would you call it?" I stared down at my hands, at the wedding ring I still wore after all these years. Thomas's ring. What would he say if he could see me now, defending the people who were systematically destroying what was left of my spirit? "She was angry," I said, but the excuse sounded pathetic even to me. "That doesn't make it okay." Lucy reached across the table and took my hands in hers. "Helen, you don't deserve this. No one deserves this. You raised that man, sacrificed for him, loved him unconditionally, and this is how he repays you? By allowing his wife to abuse you?" The kindness in her voice, the fierce protectiveness, was almost more than I could bear. When was the last time someone had defended me? When was the last time someone had seen my worth, my dignity, my right to be treated with basic human decency? "I don't know what to do," I whispered, the admission feeling like surrender and relief all at once. "Well," Lucy said, "the first thing we're going to do is document those injuries, take pictures, write down exactly what happened, and then we're going to figure out what options you have." Options? The word felt foreign in my mouth. For so long, I'd accepted that this was simply my reality, that I had no choice but to endure whatever treatment they decided I deserved. "Yes, options," Lucy said firmly. "You have more power than you think, Helen. You just need to remember how to use it." We spent the next hour documenting everything, Lucy taking careful photographs of my bruised knees and hip, writing down Margaret's exact words, creating a timeline of the escalating abuse. It was painful to see it all laid out like that, to confront the systematic nature of what had been happening to me. But it was also strangely liberating. "Now," Lucy said, closing her notebook, "tell me about your finances. Do you have any money of your own? Any assets?" I shook my head. Thomas handled all the financial matters. After he died, Jack took over everything. He said it was too complicated for me to manage, that I shouldn't worry about it. Lucy's eyes narrowed. "He took over everything? What does that mean exactly?" "The house, our house. We sold it after Thomas died. Jack said it was too big for me, too expensive to maintain. The money went into some kind of account that he manages. I get a small allowance each month for personal expenses." "An allowance," Lucy repeated, her voice carefully controlled. "Helen, do you know how much money we're talking about? How much your house sold for? What other assets Thomas might have left you?" I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I trusted Jack to handle it properly. He's a lawyer. He knows about these things." "But you never saw any paperwork? Never asked questions about where your money was going?" The more Lucy questioned me, the more I realized how completely I'd abdicated control over my own life. I'd allowed grief and trust and my own sense of inadequacy to blind me to what was happening. I'd handed over not just my money, but my independence, my autonomy, my power to make decisions about my own future. "I think," Lucy said carefully, "that we need to find out exactly what Thomas left you. What assets exist, what legal arrangements were made, what rights you have. But how? Jack has all the paperwork, and even if I asked to see it, he'd just say I wouldn't understand." Lucy smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. Leave that to me. I used to work in estate planning before Sarah died. I know exactly what documents to look for and where they're likely to be kept. You think there's something wrong with the way Jack has been handling things? I think, Lucy said, that a man who allows his wife to abuse his mother and who keeps his mother in complete ignorance about her own financial situation is capable of a lot of things. And I think it's time you found out exactly what those things are. We were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening, Jack's voice calling out that he was home early. Lucy quickly gathered her things, but before she left, she pressed a piece of paper into my hand. My phone number, she said quietly. Call me anytime, day or night. And Helen? What happened to you yesterday? It's never going to happen again. Not on my watch. As Lucy slipped out the back door, I tucked her number into my pocket like a talisman, a small piece of hope in a world that had felt hopeless for so long. Jack found me in the kitchen a few minutes later, and I braced myself for questions about the visitor, about why there were 2 teacups in the sink. But he barely glanced at me, already absorbed in whatever crisis had brought him home early. Where's Margaret? He asked without looking up from his phone. Out, I said. Volunteer. Work. He grunted in acknowledgement and disappeared into his study, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the revolutionary idea that Lucy had planted in my mind. I had options. That evening, as I sat in my room listening to the sounds of family life, happening around me but not including me, I pulled out Lucy's number and stared at it. For the first time in months, I didn't feel completely alone. Somewhere in this neighborhood was a woman who saw me as a person worth defending, worth helping, worth saving. And tomorrow, I decided, we were going to start fighting back. I looked at the faded superhero posters on the walls, at the remnants of my grandson's childhood that served as daily reminders of my displacement. But tonight, they looked different. Tonight, they looked like inspiration. Heroes, after all, weren't born powerful. They discovered their strength in their darkest moments, when they had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. I was 78 years old, and I was just beginning to discover what I was truly capable of. The woman who had cowered on the living room floor yesterday was gone. In her place was someone I barely recognized, someone who remembered what it felt like to have allies, to have options, to have hope. Margaret thought she had broken me, thought she had reduced me to nothing more than a problem to be managed and eventually disposed of. She had no idea that in pushing me down, she had actually awakened something that had been sleeping far too long. I pulled Thomas's photo from my nightstand and looked into his kind, familiar face. You always said I was stronger than I knew, I whispered. I think it's time to prove you right. Outside my window, the lights were coming on in houses. Throughout Willow Creek, families settling in for the evening, people living their lives with the assumption that tomorrow would be much like today. But in this house, in this small room with its faded posters and creaking bed, something fundamental had shifted. The woman they thought they had destroyed was gathering her strength, making plans, preparing for a battle they didn't even know was coming. And this time, she wasn't fighting alone. 3 days passed before Lucy and I could arrange to search the attic. 3 days of careful planning, of watching Margaret's schedule, of ensuring Jack would be at work and the children at school. 3 days of me pretending to be the same broken woman I'd been before, while inside, something fierce and determined was taking shape. Lucy arrived at precisely 10 in the morning, carrying a toolbox and wearing clothes suitable for dusty work. She'd thought of everything, flashlights, gloves, even a small stepladder in case we needed to reach high shelves. Her thoroughness reminded me that this wasn't just a favor for a lonely neighbor. She was treating this like the serious investigation it was. Are you ready for this? She asked as we stood at the bottom of the attic stairs. I nodded, though my heart was racing. Whatever we found up there would change everything. There would be no going back to ignorant acceptance, no more pretending that I was powerless in my own life. The attic was exactly as I remembered it, a cramped space under the eaves filled with boxes and furniture and the accumulated detritus of a life lived. Jack had moved everything from our old house up here after Thomas died, promising that I could go through it all when I was ready. But somehow, I never seemed to be ready. The grief had been too fresh, too overwhelming. Now, looking at the neat rows of labeled boxes, I realized that my reluctance hadn't been about grief at all. It had been about fear. Fear of what I might find. Fear of having to make decisions. Fear of taking control of my own life again. "Where should we start?" Lucy asked, surveying the organized chaos. I pointed to a cluster of boxes labeled "Office," in Thomas's careful handwriting. If there were financial documents anywhere, they would be there. We worked methodically, Lucy doing most of the heavy lifting while I sorted through papers and files. The first few boxes contained exactly what I expected: old tax returns, insurance policies, warranties for appliances we'd owned decades ago. Normal, mundane paperwork that any couple accumulates over 47 years of marriage. But it was in the fourth box that we found the first surprise. "Helen," Lucy said, her voice strange, "look at this." She handed me a manila folder labeled "Future Security" in Thomas's handwriting. Inside were documents I'd never seen before: investment statements, bank records, property deeds, page after page of financial information dating back years. "I don't understand," I said, staring at the numbers that seemed impossibly large. "Thomas never mentioned any of this." Lucy was reading over my shoulder, her finger tracing down columns of figures. "Helen, according to this, your husband had been building a substantial portfolio for years: stocks, bonds, real estate investments. And look at this, there's a property in Florida, a condo." A condo? I felt dizzy. We never owned a condo in Florida. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. According to this deed you do, or rather, you did. It was purchased 5 years ago, held in a trust with both your names on it. I continued rifling through the papers, each document revealing more secrets that Thomas had kept from me. Not malicious secrets. I could see from his careful notes and annotations that everything had been done with my future security in mind. But secrets nonetheless. At the bottom of the folder was a letter addressed to me in Thomas's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. "My dearest Helen, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you're finally ready to take control of what I've built for you. I know you think you don't understand money matters, that these things are too complicated for you to handle. You're wrong. You're the strongest, smartest woman I've ever known, and the only reason you don't see it is because I made the mistake of handling everything myself. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really just making you dependent. I hope it's not too late to fix that. Everything in this folder belongs to you. The investments, the properties, the bank accounts, all of it. I set it up this way so that no one could take it from you, so that you would always have the means to live independently, with dignity on your own terms. Don't let anyone tell you that you're too old, too confused, or too fragile to manage your own affairs. Don't let anyone make you feel like a burden. You earned every penny of this through 47 years of being my partner, my strength, my reason for building something lasting. The lawyer's name is Robert Chen. His contact information is in the file. He has instructions to help you with everything, to explain whatever you don't understand. Trust him. More importantly, trust yourself. You are not a burden, Helen. You never were. You are a force of nature who just forgot her own power. It's time to remember. All my love, always, Thomas. By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. Lucy had her arm around my shoulders, her own eyes bright with emotion. "Oh, Helen," she whispered. "He knew. He knew what might happen to you, and he tried to protect you. I wiped my eyes and looked at the papers scattered around us. But if all this exists, where is it? Why am I living on an allowance? Why don't I know about any of this? Lucy's expression hardened. Those are very good questions. And I think we need to find Robert Chen and get some answers. We spent another hour cataloging everything we'd found, taking pictures of the most important documents with Lucy's phone. The scope of Thomas's planning was breathtaking. He'd created a financial safety net that should have made me comfortable for the rest of my life. Instead, I'd been living like a charity case, dependent on my son's grudging support. There's something else we need to look for, Lucy said as we prepared to leave the attic. Death certificates, probate documents, anything related to the settling of Thomas's estate. We found those in the last box we searched, tucked away in a folder marked legal. And that's where the real shock came. According to the probate documents, Thomas had died with assets worth over $2 million. The house Jack had claimed was too expensive to maintain had sold for $480,000. There were stock portfolios, savings accounts, the Florida condo, and a life insurance policy worth $300,000. But according to the settlement documents I was seeing, for the first time, almost everything had been placed in a trust with Jack as the trustee and me as the beneficiary. In theory, the money was still mine. In practice, Jack controlled every penny. This is incredible, Lucy said, studying the trust documents. Helen, you're not poor. You're not dependent on anyone's charity. You're a wealthy woman whose son has been controlling your money. I stared at the papers, trying to process what I was seeing. But why? Why would Jack do this? Why would he let me think I had nothing? Lucy was quiet for a moment, still reading. Then she looked up with an expression I'd never seen before, pure, cold fury. Because, she said, according to this trust document, if you die, everything goes to Jack. But if you're still alive when you turn 80, you regain complete control of the assets. You can dissolve the trust, fire him as trustee, do whatever you want with your own money. The implications hit me like a physical blow. I'll be 80 in 18 months. Exactly. 18 months until you can take control of everything. Thomas left you. 18 months until Jack loses his free access to your money. I thought about Margaret's comments about facilities, about being a burden, about everyone waiting for me to die. I thought about the cheap cereal and the deliberate humiliations, about being made to feel worthless and unwanted. They want me gone before then, I said quietly. I think they want you gone, period, Lucy replied grimly. But definitely before you turn 80. We sat in the dusty attic surrounded by the evidence of Thomas's love and foresight, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who had crept down these stairs a few hours ago, defeated, dependent, apologetic for her very existence, was gone. In her place was someone I barely recognized but was beginning to like very much. What do we do now? I asked. Lucy smiled, and there was something fierce and determined in the expression. Now? Now we call Robert Chen and find out exactly what rights you have. Then we figure out how to use them. As we climbed down from the attic, carrying with us the proof of what had been hidden from me, I felt like I was descending into a completely different life. The house looked the same, but everything had changed. I wasn't the helpless dependent I'd believed myself to be. I was a woman with resources, with options, with power. Margaret and Jack had built their control over me on a foundation of lies and deliberate ignorance. They'd counted on my grief, my trust, my willingness to believe that I was incapable of managing my own affairs. They'd made a terrible miscalculation. That afternoon, while Margaret was at her book club and Jack was in court, Lucy and I called Robert Chen from the kitchen phone. He was still practicing, still sharp at 72, and when I explained who I was, His voice warmed immediately. "Helen, I've been wondering when you'd contact me. Thomas made me promise to be available whenever you were ready to take control of your affairs." "I think I'm ready now," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "Excellent. Can you come to my office tomorrow? We have a lot to discuss." After I hung up, Lucy and I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten countless lonely meals, where I'd been dismissed and diminished, and planned our next moves. "You realize," Lucy said, "that once you start asserting your rights, things are going to get very unpleasant around here." I nodded. I was under no illusions about how Jack and Margaret would react to discovering that their control over me was ending. The woman they'd been able to manipulate and intimidate was about to be replaced by someone with the resources to fight back. "I'm not the same person I was a week ago," I said. "I'm not going to be pushed around anymore." Lucy reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Good. Because I have a feeling you're going to need every bit of that strength for what's coming." As the afternoon light faded, I sat alone in the kitchen and thought about the letter Thomas had left me. He'd seen this coming, had tried to protect me even after death. But more than that, he'd believed in me, in my ability to stand up for myself when the time came. The time had come. Tomorrow, I would meet with Robert Chen and learn exactly what weapons Thomas had given me. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming my life, my dignity, my independence. Tonight, I would prepare for war. The law office of Robert Chen occupied the second floor of a modest building downtown, the kind of place that spoke of competence rather than flash, of substance over style. As Lucy and I climbed the stairs the next morning, I felt a nervousness I hadn't experienced in years, not the cringing anxiety of someone expecting punishment, but the electric anticipation of someone about to reclaim their power. Robert Chen was exactly what I'd expected from Thomas's description, a small, precise man with kind eyes and an aura of quiet authority. His office was lined with law books and family photos, the desk covered with neat stacks of papers that suggested a mind that valued order and thoroughness. "Helen," he said, rising from behind his desk with a genuine smile. "I've been waiting for this day for 3 years." "3 years?" I asked, settling into the comfortable chair across from his desk. "That's how long it's been since Thomas died, and how long I've been wondering when you'd contact me. He made me promise to give you space to grieve, to come to terms with your loss in your own time. But he also made me promise to be ready when you were." Robert pulled out a thick file and set it on the desk between us. "Before we begin, I need to ask you some questions. Are you currently living with your son, Jack?" "Yes." "And who has been managing your financial affairs since Thomas's death?" "Jack has been handling everything. He said it was too complicated for me to understand." Robert's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. And are you aware of the extent of the assets Thomas left you?" I pulled out the papers Lucy and I had copied from the attic. "I found these yesterday. I had no idea any of it existed." Robert studied the documents, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Helen, I need you to understand something very important. According to the terms of Thomas's will and the trust he established, you should have been informed of all these assets immediately, upon his death. You should have been receiving detailed quarterly reports about the trust's performance. You should have been consulted about any major financial decisions." "But I wasn't," I said, feeling a familiar surge of anger. "I was told there was just enough money to cover basic expenses that I needed to be careful not to spend too much." "That's not just unethical," Robert said quietly. "It's illegal. A trustee has a fiduciary duty to keep the beneficiary informed about the trust's assets and performance. Jack has been in violation of his legal obligations from the day he took over as trustee." Lucy leaned forward. "What can Helen do about it?" Robert opened the file and pulled out several documents. Quite a lot, actually. Thomas was very specific about Helen's rights. First, she has the absolute right to detailed accounting of every penny that's been spent or invested since his death. Second, she can remove Jack as trustee at any time and appoint someone else, including herself. Third, when she turns 80, the trust dissolves automatically, and she gains complete control of all assets. "I'll be 80 in 18 months, I said. "I know," Robert smiled. "Thomas was very particular about that date. He wanted to ensure that you had time to adjust to widowhood while also guaranteeing that you wouldn't be dependent on anyone indefinitely." He pulled out another document. "There's something else. Thomas left specific instructions for what should happen if he suspected you were being mistreated or taken advantage of. He authorized me to investigate your living situation and, if necessary, to take immediate action to protect your interests." "What kind of action?" Lucy asked. "I can petition the court to remove Jack as trustee immediately if there's evidence of misconduct. I can also help Helen establish her own residence and financial independence. Thomas set aside a special fund, specifically for this purpose, money that can't be touched by the trust, money that's available to Helen immediately if she needs it." I stared at him. "How much money?" $200,000 in an account with only your name on it. Thomas opened it the year before he died and made sure it was completely separate from everything else." The room seemed to spin slightly. $200,000. I'd been living on an allowance of $300 a month, asking permission to buy new clothes, feeling grateful for the roof over my head. Meanwhile, I had enough money to live independently for years. "There's more," Robert continued gently. "The Florida condo is also held separately from the trust. It's yours outright, no strings attached. Thomas wanted to ensure you had a place to go if you ever needed to leave Jack's house." "I could leave today if I wanted to," I said, the words coming out in a whisper of amazement. "You could leave today," Robert confirmed. "In fact, given what you've told me about your living situation, I think Thomas would strongly encourage you to do exactly that." We spent the next 2 hours going through everything: account balances, investment performance, property values. The picture that emerged was of a woman who was far from helpless, far from dependent. I was, as Lucy had said, a wealthy woman who had been deliberately kept in ignorance of her own resources. But it was when Robert showed me the records of withdrawals from the trust that my anger finally transformed into something harder and more focused. "Jack has been taking a trustee fee of $5,000 per month," Robert explained. "That's actually within normal limits for managing a trust of this size, but he's also been making other withdrawals." The list was staggering. Private school tuition for the children, $40,000 per year. A new car for Margaret, $38,000. Home renovations, $65,000. A family vacation to Europe, $22,000. "Can he do that?" I asked. "Technically, yes, if the expenses can be justified as being for your benefit or care. But I'm having trouble seeing how a European vacation or a luxury car for your daughter-in-law qualifies." "This is theft," Lucy said flatly. "It's certainly grounds for removing him as trustee," Robert agreed. "The question is, what do you want to do about it, Helen?" I sat quietly for a moment, thinking about everything I'd learned. 3 years of being made to feel like a burden, like a charity case, like someone whose very existence was an imposition. 3 years of accepting scraps while my own money paid for their luxuries. "I want my life back," I said finally. "I want control of my own money, my own decisions. I want to live with dignity." Robert nodded. "Then here's what I propose. We start by demanding a complete accounting of all trust assets and expenditures. We establish your right to immediate access to the separate funds Thomas set aside, and we make it clear that his stewardship of your trust is being reviewed by independent counsel." "How will Jack react to that?" Lucy asked. "Not well," Robert said honestly. "People who have been taking advantage of someone's vulnerability rarely respond positively to having their actions scrutinized. I thought about Jack, about the son I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for. The little boy who used to crawl into my lap when he was scared, who used to tell me I was the best mother in the world. When had he become someone who could look at my dependence and see opportunity? When had his love for me been replaced by resentment and greed? I need to tell him myself, I said. Before lawyers get involved, before this becomes a legal battle, I need to look my son in the eye and tell him what I know. Robert looked concerned. Helen, given what you've told me about your daughter-in-law's behavior, confronting them directly might not be safe. I'll be there, Lucy said firmly. And we'll make sure everything is documented. But I think Helen's right. She deserves the chance to face them as an equal, not as a victim. That evening, I sat in my room preparing for what might be the most important conversation of my life. I'd asked Lucy to be present, had arranged for Robert to be available, by phone if needed. I'd prepared copies of the key documents, evidence of what they'd hidden from me and what they'd taken. But more importantly, I'd prepared myself emotionally for the end of the illusions I'd been clinging to about my family. The woman who would walk downstairs tonight wouldn't be the broken, grateful dependent who had been living in this house. She would be Helen Green, widow of Thomas Green, mother of Jack Green, and a person with rights and resources and the will to use them. When I heard Jack's car in the driveway, I took a deep breath and checked my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me stood straighter, held her head higher. Her eyes were clear and determined. It was time. I made my way downstairs, where Margaret was starting dinner and Jack was sorting through the mail. They looked up as I entered the kitchen, and I saw Jack do a double take at something in my expression. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady and clear. "All of us, now." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "About what?" I set the folder of documents on the kitchen table. "About the trust fund, about my money, about the lies you've been telling me for 3 years." The silence that followed was electric with tension and the sudden, sharp awareness that everything was about to change. Jack's face went white. Margaret's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. They stared at the documents as if they were venomous, snakes that had suddenly appeared in their kitchen. "Where did you get those?" Jack asked, his lawyer's training allowing him to find his voice first. "From the attic. From the boxes you stored up there and told me I wasn't ready to go through." "Helen," Margaret said, her voice taking on the condescending tone she used when she thought I was being difficult. "You don't understand what you're looking at. These financial matters are very complicated. Stop." The word came out with such authority that Margaret actually stepped back. "Don't you dare talk to me like I'm a child. I understand perfectly what I'm looking at. I understand that you've been lying to me. I understand that you've been spending my money while telling me I'm a burden you can barely afford to support." Jack was looking through the papers now, his face growing paler with each page. "Mom, you have to understand. Managing a trust is complicated. There are expenses, fees. $65,000 for home renovations?" I cut him off. $38,000 for Margaret's car? $22,000 for your family vacation to Europe? What expenses of mine do those cover exactly? The kitchen had become a battlefield, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't the one being attacked. Margaret recovered first, her face twisting into the cruel expression I'd become so familiar with. "You ungrateful. Do you have any idea what we've sacrificed to take care of you? What we've given up to have you living here?" "What you've sacrificed." I laughed, and the sound was harsh and unfamiliar. "Margaret, you've been living in luxury on my money while making me feel grateful for scraps. You pushed me down, left me bleeding on the floor, and told me everyone was waiting for me to die. What exactly have you sacrificed?" Jack looked stricken. "She didn't. Margaret, you didn't really—" "Oh, she did," I said. "And you let her. You enabled her. You turned your mother into a cash cow and let your wife abuse her. The truth was finally out in the open, raw and undeniable. The careful edifice of lies and manipulation that had controlled my life for 3 years was crumbling, and there was no going back. "What do you want?" Jack asked quietly, and I could see in his eyes that he knew this was the end of everything as it had been. "I want my life back," I said. "I want control of my money. I want to live with dignity, and I want both of you to understand that the helpless old woman you've been taking advantage of is gone forever." Margaret's mask slipped completely. "You can't do this. You're old, you're confused, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I said, rising from my chair with a grace and authority I'd forgotten I possessed. "I understand that tomorrow I'm meeting with Robert Chen to remove Jack as trustee. I understand that I have my own money, my own property, my own options. And I understand that I don't have to spend another day in this house being treated like garbage by people who should love me." The woman who walked out of that kitchen wasn't the same woman who had walked in. She was someone I'd thought was lost forever. Someone strong. Someone who demanded respect. Someone who refused to be anyone's victim. Behind me, I could hear Margaret's voice rising in fury and Jack's attempts to calm her down. But their voices were already fading into irrelevance. I had found my power, and I was never giving it up again. The aftermath of that kitchen confrontation was like watching a dam burst. For 3 years, I had been the compliant victim, absorbing their anger and manipulation without fighting back. Now, suddenly, the power dynamics had shifted so dramatically that neither Jack nor Margaret seemed to know how to respond. I spent that night in my room, listening to the heated arguments downstairs. Margaret's voice was shrill with panic, demanding that Jack do something about the situation. Jack's responses were muffled but clearly defensive, the tone of a man who knew he'd been caught and was scrambling to find justification for his actions. Lucy called around 10 to check on me. "How did it go?" she asked. "Like detonating a bomb in their perfect little world," I replied, and was surprised to find myself smiling. "Margaret is furious, Jack is scared, and I feel more alive than I have in years. Any regrets?" I considered this. A week ago, the thought of disrupting the family peace would have horrified me. I would have done anything to avoid conflict, to maintain the illusion of harmony, even at the cost of my own dignity. "None," I said, and meant it. "Whatever happens, now, at least it will be honest." The next morning brought the first real test of my newfound resolve. I came downstairs to find Margaret waiting for me in the kitchen, her appearance carefully arranged, hair perfect, makeup flawless, wearing the kind of outfit that suggested both vulnerability and determination. "Helen," she said, her voice soft and reasonable. "I think we need to clear the air about yesterday. I'm afraid there were some misunderstandings." I poured myself coffee and sat at the table, studying her performance with new eyes. This was Margaret at her most dangerous, not the cruel harridan who had pushed me to the floor, but the charming manipulator who had convinced my son to marry her. "I don't think there were any misunderstandings," I said calmly. "I think everything was quite clear." "You have to understand the position we've been in," she continued, leaning forward with an expression of earnest concern. "Taking care of an elderly relative is such a huge responsibility. The financial burden, the emotional strain, we've been doing our best, but sometimes it's overwhelming." "The financial burden," I repeated. "You mean the burden of spending? My money on yourselves while telling me I was lucky to have a roof over my head?" Her mask slipped for just a moment, a flash of anger breaking through the carefully constructed facade. "It's not that simple, Helen. Managing your affairs, making sure you're cared for. Do you have any idea how much time and energy that takes?" "No," I said, "but I'm about to find out, since I'll be managing my own affairs from now on." "That's what I wanted to talk to you about." Margaret's voice took on a note of gentle concern that made my skin crawl. Helen, you're 78 years old. You've been out of the workforce for decades. Financial management has become so much more complicated than it used to be. Computers, online banking, investment portfolios. It's all so confusing, even for people much younger than you. The condescension was breathtaking, delivered with such practiced sincerity that I could see how she'd fooled Jack for so long. This was how she operated. Not through crude insults, but through subtle erosion of confidence, making her victims doubt their own capabilities until they became dependent on her expertise. You're right, I said, and watched her face light up with premature victory. Financial management is complicated. That's why Thomas left detailed instructions with Robert Chen about how to help me handle everything. Her expression froze. Robert Chen? Thomas's lawyer. He's been waiting for 3 years for me to contact him. Apparently, there are quite a few things about the trust that Jack should have explained to me but didn't. Margaret's carefully constructed sympathy was cracking like old paint. Helen, you can't seriously be considering turning our family's private business over to some stranger. Robert Chen isn't a stranger. He was Thomas's friend and advisor for 20 years. Jack is the stranger here, the one who's been lying. To me and stealing from me. Stealing? Margaret's voice rose in outrage. How dare you accuse Jack of stealing? Everything he's done has been for your benefit, for this family. Margaret. I stood up, and something in my posture made her step back instinctively. Stop. Just stop. The performance isn't working anymore. I know what you are, what you've both been doing. The only question now is whether you're going to accept the new reality with some grace, or whether this is going to get ugly. For a moment, we stared at each other across the kitchen table, and I saw her calculating, trying to find a new angle of attack. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder, more honest in its cruelty. You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you've figured it all out. But you're forgetting something important, Helen. This is our house, our family, our life. You're just a guest here, and guests who become inconvenient don't get to stay. You're absolutely right, I said, pulling out my phone, which is why I won't be staying. I dialed the number Robert Chen had given me for emergencies. He answered on the second ring. Robert, it's Helen Green. I think it's time to implement Thomas's contingency plan. 20 minutes later, Lucy arrived with a suitcase and a grim expression. Behind her was a man I didn't recognize, tall, professional-looking, carrying a briefcase. Helen, Lucy said, this is David Morrison. He's a private investigator Robert Chen hired to document your living situation. Margaret, who had been growing increasingly agitated as she listened to my phone calls, exploded. You can't bring strangers into my house. You have no right. Actually, David Morrison said calmly, opening his briefcase, Mrs. Green has every right. I have a court order allowing me to investigate potential elder abuse and financial exploitation. I'll need to interview both you and your husband, and I'll need access to all financial records related to Mrs. Green's trust. This is insane, Margaret snapped. Helen, you're destroying this family over a misunderstanding. Think about what you're doing to Jack, to the children. I'm thinking about what's been done to me, I replied. For 3 years I've been thinking about everyone else's feelings, everyone else's needs. Today, I'm thinking about mine. Jack arrived home early, summoned by frantic calls from Margaret. He walked into a kitchen that had been transformed into something resembling a crime scene investigation. Documents spread across the table, David Morrison taking photographs, Lucy standing protectively beside me like a bodyguard. What the hell is going on here? He demanded. Your mother is having some kind of breakdown, Margaret said before I could speak. She's brought strangers into our house. She's making wild accusations. I'm exercising my legal rights, I corrected. Rights your husband should have explained to me 3 years ago. Jack looked at the papers on the table, and I saw the moment when he realized how much trouble he was in. His face went pale, then flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Mom, you can't seriously believe I've been taking care of you, protecting your interests. By spending my money on your family vacations while telling me I should be grateful for cheap cereal? Those expenses were theft, David Morrison said quietly, not looking up from his documentation. At least, that's what the court will call it when they see these records. The kitchen erupted into chaos. Margaret began screaming about ungrateful relatives and destroyed families. Jack shouted about loyalty and sacrifice. But through it all, I stood calm and centered, finally understanding what Thomas had meant when he said I was stronger than I knew. This was strength, not the ability to endure abuse, but the courage to stop it, not the willingness to sacrifice everything for family peace, but the determination to demand respect and dignity. Enough, I said, and my voice cut through the noise like a blade. Here's what's going to happen. Jack, you're going to cooperate fully with Mr. Morrison's investigation. You're going to provide complete accounting of every penny you've spent from my trust. And you're going to resign as trustee immediately. And if I refuse? Jack asked, his lawyer's instincts finally kicking in. Then Robert Chen will file a formal complaint with the State Bar Association about your violation of fiduciary duty, and Mr. Morrison will present his evidence of financial elder abuse to the district attorney's office. Margaret let out a sound. That was half laugh, half snarl. You think you can threaten us? You think you can come into our house and destroy our lives because you're having some kind of senior moment? I walked over to where she stood, and for the first time in our relationship, I was the one looking down at her with authority. Margaret, I said quietly, you pushed me down, left me bleeding, and told me everyone was waiting for me to die. You've spent 3 years making me feel worthless while living in luxury on my money. If anyone's life is about to be destroyed, it's because of choices you made, not actions I'm taking. I turned back to Jack, seeing in his face the final death of the illusion that we were a loving family working through difficult circumstances. We were what we had always been, what I had simply refused to see. Predators and prey. You have 48 hours to provide the accounting, I said. After that, this becomes a matter for the courts. As I walked out of the kitchen, Lucy and David Morrison flanking me like an honor guard, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the intoxicating sensation of being in control of my own destiny. Behind me, I could hear Margaret's voice, rising to a shriek. You'll regret this. You'll be back, begging us to take care of you again. But I knew better. The woman who had begged for scraps of affection and acceptance was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood her own worth, someone who refused to be anyone's victim. I was 78 years old, and I was just beginning to understand what it meant to be truly free. The war wasn't over. There would be legal battles, family, recriminations, the messy process of untangling 3 years of lies and manipulation. But the most important battle had already been won. I had found my voice, reclaimed my power, and remembered what Thomas had always known, that I was stronger than anyone, including myself, had ever imagined. The 48 hours that followed my ultimatum were unlike anything I had ever experienced. For the first time in my adult life, I was living in open warfare with my own family, and the battlefield was the house where I had hoped to spend my final years in peace and dignity. Margaret's initial shock had crystallized into something far more dangerous, cold, calculated fury. She moved through the house like a general preparing for siege, making phone calls, sending emails, marshaling her resources for what she clearly saw as the fight of her life. I overheard her on the phone with her sister, her voice pitched to carry the maximum emotional impact. She's lost her mind, Susan. Completely paranoid, talking about conspiracies and theft. We're dealing with full-blown dementia here, and she's being manipulated by some neighbor woman who's obviously after her money." The lies were breathtaking in their scope and sophistication. According to Margaret's version of events, I was a confused old woman being taken advantage of by Lucy, who had somehow convinced me that my loving family was stealing from me. My sudden assertiveness wasn't evidence of returning strength. It was proof of mental deterioration. "We're going to have to get a competency evaluation," I heard her tell someone else. "It's heartbreaking, but we can't let her destroy the family because she's not thinking clearly." A competency evaluation. The phrase sent ice through my veins. If Margaret could convince a doctor that I was mentally incompetent, she could have me declared unfit to manage my own affairs. Everything I had fought to reclaim, my independence, my dignity, my control over my own life, could be stripped away with a single court order. Lucy found me sitting in my room that evening, staring out the window at the darkening sky. She took one look at my face and knew immediately that something had shifted. "What happened?" she asked, settling into the chair beside my bed. I told her about Margaret's phone calls, about the strategy I could see taking shape. "She's going to try to have me declared incompetent," I said. "She's going to paint me as a confused old woman who's been manipulated by you into turning against my family." Lucy was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her mind working through the implications. "Would that work?" she asked finally. "I don't know. Maybe. I am 78 years old. I have been dependent on Jack for 3 years. A doctor who doesn't know me, who only sees what Margaret wants them to see." I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "No," Lucy said firmly. "No, we're not going to let that happen. Helen, you're one of the sharpest, most articulate people I know. Any competent doctor would see that within 5 minutes of talking to you. But what if they don't get 5 minutes? What if Margaret controls the narrative from the beginning?" Lucy stood up and began pacing, her movements sharp with agitation. "Then we control it first. We get you examined by an independent doctor, someone Robert Chen recommends. We document your competency before Margaret has a chance to plant seeds of doubt." It was a sound strategy, but I could see the larger war Margaret was waging. This wasn't just about competency evaluations. It was about credibility, about who would be believed when the dust settled. "There's something else," I said. "The children." Lucy stopped pacing. "What about them?" "Margaret's been working on them too. I heard her talking to Emma yesterday, telling her that Grandma wasn't feeling well, that I might be saying some confusing things. She's preparing them to see me as sick, as someone whose words can't be trusted." The cruelty of it was staggering. Not content with stealing my money and destroying my dignity, Margaret was now poisoning my relationship with my grandchildren, ensuring that even they would see me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house around me, Jack's stressed pacing in his study, Margaret's muffled phone conversations, the distant hum of the air conditioning. This place that had never really felt like home now felt actively hostile, as if the walls themselves were conspiring against me. But in the darkness, I found something unexpected: gratitude. For 3 years, I had lived with the gnawing sense that something was wrong, that I was missing some crucial piece of information about my own life. The constant anxiety, the feeling of walking on eggshells, the way every conversation felt loaded with hidden meanings, all of it suddenly made sense. I hadn't been going crazy. I had been gaslighted, systematically and deliberately, by people who needed me to doubt my own perceptions in order to maintain their control over me. The next morning brought a new escalation. I came downstairs to find Jack sitting at the kitchen table with a woman I'd never seen before, middle-aged, professionally dressed, carrying a briefcase that screamed official business. "Mom," Jack said, his voice carefully controlled. "This is Dr. Sarah Patterson. She's a geriatric psychiatrist. Margaret and I thought it might be helpful for you to talk to someone about the stress you've been under lately. Dr. Patterson smiled, with the kind of practiced warmth that mental health professionals perfect over years of dealing with difficult patients. Hello, Helen. I understand you've been going through a challenging time. The ambush was perfectly orchestrated. I was alone, outnumbered, caught off guard. Margaret stood in the doorway watching, her expression carefully arranged to suggest loving concern masking deep worry. I haven't been under any stress, I said, keeping my voice level. I've been discovering the truth about my financial situation. Yes, Dr. Patterson said, consulting a notepad. Your son mentioned that you've become concerned about money recently. That's actually quite common in people your age. Financial anxiety, particularly fears about being taken advantage of, can be an early sign of cognitive changes. The trap was so elegant I almost admired it. Every word I said to defend myself would be interpreted as further evidence of my deteriorating mental state. If I insisted that Jack had been stealing from me, it would sound like paranoid delusions. If I remained calm and rational, it would suggest that I was being manipulated by outside forces. Dr. Patterson, I said carefully, before we continue, I think you should know that I have documentation of irregularities in how my financial affairs have been handled. I've been working with my late husband's attorney to review these issues. Of course, she said, making notes. And what's this attorney's name? Robert Chen. I saw Jack and Margaret exchange a look. They had clearly anticipated this. Mom, Jack said gently, Robert Chen is 83 years old. He's been having some health issues recently. Memory problems. We're concerned that he might not be the most reliable source of information anymore. It was a lie, and a clever one. By attacking Robert's credibility, they were undermining my only source of independent verification for everything I'd discovered. That's interesting, I said, pulling out my phone, because I spoke with him yesterday and he seemed perfectly sharp to me. Dr. Patterson leaned forward with renewed interest. Helen, how often have you been speaking with Mr. Chen? Every day since I discovered the truth about my trust. And before that? How long had it been since you'd spoken with him? I hesitated. 3 years, since my husband died. So you hadn't maintained contact with your husband's attorney for 3 years, and then suddenly you began calling him daily after finding some documents that concerned you. The way she phrased it made my behavior sound obsessive, unstable. I could see the narrative taking shape in her mind. An elderly woman, isolated and confused, fixating on imagined financial irregularities and bombarding an elderly lawyer with paranoid concerns. The documents I found prove that Jack has been mismanaging my trust, I said firmly. What sort of documents? Dr. Patterson asked. I started to explain about the investment statements, the property records, the evidence of unauthorized expenditures. But as I spoke, I could see her expression growing more skeptical, more concerned. To someone who didn't know the background, who was predisposed to see my assertions as symptoms rather than facts, I must have sounded exactly like what Margaret was claiming I was. A confused old woman spinning elaborate fantasies about financial conspiracies. Helen, Dr. Patterson said when I finished, I can see why these discoveries would be upsetting. It's natural to want to understand your financial situation, but I'm wondering if there might be some misinterpretation of complex financial documents. Trust management involves many transactions that can seem irregular to someone without extensive financial background. I'm not misinterpreting anything, I said, but I could hear how defensive I sounded. Of course not intentionally, she said soothingly. But financial documents can be very confusing, especially for someone who hasn't been involved in managing them directly. Every word was a small cut, designed to undermine my confidence in my own perceptions. This woman had been briefed by Jack and Margaret, primed to see me as a victim of age-related confusion rather than actual victimization. I think, Dr. Patterson continued, it might be helpful for you to come to my office for a more comprehensive evaluation, just to make Sure, we're not missing anything that might be affecting your thinking. No, I said, standing up. I don't need an evaluation. I need my family to stop lying to me and stealing from me. The outburst was exactly what they'd been hoping for. Margaret stepped forward with an expression of wounded concern. Helen, please don't get upset. We're only trying to help. Help? I laughed bitterly. You pushed me down, told me everyone was waiting for me to die, and now you're trying to have me declared incompetent so you can keep stealing my money. That's not help. That's abuse. Dr. Patterson was scribbling frantically now, documenting my paranoid statements and aggressive behavior. I realized that everything I said was being used as ammunition against me, that this entire encounter had been designed to create evidence of my instability. I think we should continue this conversation at my office, Dr. Patterson said. Perhaps tomorrow morning? Perhaps never, I replied, walking toward the door. I'll be getting my own. Psychiatric evaluation, thank you, from someone who doesn't have a financial interest in finding me incompetent. As I left the kitchen, I heard Margaret's voice behind me. You see what we're dealing with. The paranoia, the hostility. It's heartbreaking. I went straight to my room and called Lucy, my hands shaking with rage and fear. They brought in a psychiatrist, I told her. They're trying to build a case that I'm mentally incompetent. Bastards, Lucy said succinctly. But they made a mistake. They showed their hand too early. Now we know what we're fighting and we can prepare. What if it works? What if they convince a judge that I'm not capable of managing my own affairs? Then we make sure they can't. Helen, you're about to become the most thoroughly documented competent person in the state of California. We're going to get you examined by the best geriatric psychiatrist Robert can find. We're going to have cognitive testing, psychological evaluations, the works. By the time we're done, there won't be a court in the country that would question your mental capacity. The relief in her voice was infectious, and I felt some of my panic begin to subside. You really think that will work? I know it will. Because you're not actually incompetent, Helen. You're just a woman who's been systematically gaslighted by people who needed you to doubt yourself. Once you're evaluated by neutral professionals who aren't being manipulated by Jack and Margaret, the truth will be obvious. That afternoon, while Jack was at work and Margaret was at one of her volunteer commitments, Lucy came over with a plan. We spent 2 hours on the phone with Robert Chen, coordinating our strategy. The first thing we need to do, Robert explained, is get ahead of their narrative. I'm scheduling you for comprehensive psychological and cognitive testing with Dr. Michael Ross. He's the best geriatric psychiatrist in the city, and he's completely independent. No connection to your family, no preconceived notions about your case. How long will that take? I asked. The testing can be done this week. But Helen, there's something else we need to discuss. Given what's happening, I think it's time to consider whether you should continue living in Jack's house. The question I'd been avoiding finally came into sharp focus. Could I continue to live with people who saw me as an enemy to be defeated rather than a family member to be loved? I have the condo in Florida, I said slowly. You do. It's fully furnished, ready for occupancy. You could be there by the end of the week if you wanted. The thought of starting over at 78 was terrifying. But the thought of staying here, under siege from my own family, was worse. Let me think about it, I said. That evening, I sat in my room surrounded by the evidence of my diminished life, the single bed, the faded posters, the few personal possessions I'd been allowed to keep when I moved in. This wasn't a home. It was a prison I'd walked into voluntarily, believing that love and gratitude would protect me. I thought about Thomas, about the life we'd built together, about the woman I'd been when he was alive. That woman wouldn't have tolerated this treatment for 5 minutes, let alone 3 years. It was time to find her again. I picked up my phone and called Robert Chen. Robert, it's Helen. I want to see the condo. I want to see what Thomas built for me. Excellent, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I'll make the arrangements. Helen, Thomas would be very proud of you. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the war wasn't about staying or going anymore. It was about reclaiming. The person I'd always been underneath the fear and dependence. Someone strong enough to build a new life, even at 78. Margaret thought she was fighting to keep her comfortable lifestyle funded by my money. Jack thought he was fighting to maintain his control over my assets. But I was fighting for something much more fundamental, my right to exist as a complete human being, worthy of respect and capable of determining my own fate. And that was a fight I intended to win. The law offices of Chen and Associates had been transformed into a war room. Documents covered every available surface: bank statements, investment records, property deeds, and trust agreements, creating a paper trail of 3 years of systematic financial abuse. Robert Chen moved between the piles with the energy of a man half his age, his earlier health issues apparently forgotten in the face of what he clearly saw as a righteous cause. "This is actually quite remarkable," he said, holding up a series of withdrawal authorizations. "In 40 years of practice, I've rarely seen such blatant disregard for fiduciary duty. Jack didn't just bend the rules, he broke them systematically and documented every violation." I sat across from his desk, feeling oddly calm despite the magnitude of what we were undertaking. The psychological evaluation Dr. Ross had conducted the day before had been thorough, and according to Robert, devastatingly favorable to our case. "Dr. Ross's report is unequivocal," Robert continued. "You scored in the superior range on all cognitive tests. Your memory, reasoning ability, and judgment are all well above average for your age group. More importantly, he found no evidence whatsoever of dementia, depression, or any other condition that would affect your decision-making capacity." The relief I felt was profound. For months, Margaret's constant implications that I was confused, forgetful, or incompetent had created a seed of doubt in my own mind. Even as I fought back against their treatment, part of me had wondered if perhaps they were right, if age really had diminished my ability to think clearly. Dr. Ross had put those fears to rest permanently. Not only was I mentally sharp, I was functioning at a level that would be impressive for someone decades younger. "What's our next move?" I asked. Robert consulted his notes. "Jack's attorney, Richard Brennan, has requested a meeting. Apparently, Jack finally understands the seriousness of his situation and wants to discuss a settlement." "A settlement?" The idea hadn't occurred to me. What would that involve? Essentially, Jack would resign as trustee, provide full restitution for any unauthorized expenditures, and transfer complete control of your assets to you immediately. In exchange, you would agree not to pursue criminal charges or file a complaint with the State Bar Association. I considered this. Part of me was tempted by the idea of a quick resolution, of avoiding the messy public battle that a full legal proceeding would entail. But another part of me, the part that had been systematically humiliated and degraded for 3 years, wanted more than just restitution. What about the psychological evaluation they tried to spring on me? What about their attempt to have me declared incompetent? Robert's expression hardened. That's actually going to work in our favor. Dr. Patterson's preliminary assessment was based entirely on information provided by Jack and Margaret. When the court sees that assessment alongside Dr. Ross's comprehensive evaluation, it's going to look like a deliberate attempt to manipulate the medical evaluation process. Lucy arrived at the law office just as Robert was explaining the timeline for the legal proceedings. She'd taken time off work to be with me during these crucial days, and her presence had been invaluable, not just for practical support, but as a witness to my competence and rationality. "How are you holding up?" she asked, settling into the chair beside me. "Better than I expected," I said honestly. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm fighting for something instead of just enduring whatever happens to me. Jack's attorney called this morning, Robert told Lucy. They want to meet tomorrow to discuss terms? I suspect they're beginning to realize how weak their position actually is. What makes you say that? Lucy asked. Robert smiled grimly. Because Richard Brennan is a smart lawyer, and smart lawyers don't usually agree to emergency settlement conferences unless their clients are facing serious legal jeopardy. When you combine the financial irregularities with the attempted medical manipulation, Jack is looking at potential criminal charges, disbarment proceedings, and civil liability that could bankrupt him. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock, the following afternoon in a conference room at Brennan's law firm. I spent the morning at Lucy's house, trying to prepare mentally for what would likely be my last face-to-face encounter with Jack for a very long time. Are you nervous? Lucy asked as we drove downtown. Terrified, I admitted, but not of them anymore. I'm terrified of what this means for my family, for my grandchildren. Whatever Jack has done, he's still my son. Emma and Michael are still my grandchildren. I know, Lucy said gently. But Helen, you can't sacrifice your dignity and independence to preserve relationships that were already destroying you. Sometimes love means setting boundaries, even when it's painful. The law firm of Brennan and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a downtown high-rise, the kind of place that existed to intimidate people into submission through sheer architectural authority. But as I walked through the marble lobby and rode the elevator to the 40th floor, I felt none of the anxiety I would have experienced just weeks earlier. I was no longer the helpless dependent who had been grateful for whatever scraps of affection her family was willing to provide. I was Helen Green, a woman of means and intelligence who deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. The conference room was exactly what I'd expected. Gleaming mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Jack was already there when we arrived, sitting beside a man I assumed was Richard Brennan. Jack looked terrible. The confident, successful lawyer I'd known had been replaced by someone who appeared to have aged 5 years in the past week. His face was pale and drawn, his expensive suit wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled. "Hello, Jack," I said quietly, taking my seat across from him. "Mom." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm glad you came." Richard Brennan was a type I recognized from Jack's previous descriptions. Silver-haired, expensively dressed, radiating the kind of confidence that came from years of winning battles for wealthy clients. But today, that confidence seemed forced, a performance rather than genuine conviction. "Mrs. Green," he said, standing to shake my hand, "thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I think we can find a resolution that works for everyone." "Robert." Chen arranged his documents on the table with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. "Before we begin, I want to make sure everyone understands the scope of what we're dealing with here." For the next 30 minutes, Robert methodically presented the evidence of Jack's violations, unauthorized expenditures totaling over $300,000. Failure to provide required reporting to the beneficiary, investment decisions made without consultation or notification, the attempted medical manipulation to have me declared incompetent. With each revelation, Jack seemed to shrink further into his chair. I found myself feeling an unexpected mixture of anger and pity. Anger at what he'd done, pity for what he'd become. "Obviously," Brennan said when Robert finished, "there have been some irregularities in the trust management. My client is prepared to acknowledge certain oversights and to make appropriate restitution." "Oversights?" Lucy's voice was sharp with disbelief. "He stole over $300,000 and tried to have his mother declared mentally incompetent to cover it up. Those aren't oversights, they're crimes." Brennan's polished demeanor flickered slightly. The expenditures in question were made in good faith, with the belief that they were beneficial to the trust beneficiary. A European vacation was beneficial to Helen? Robert interrupted. A luxury car for Jack's wife? Private school tuition that Helen never approved? Jack thought, Brennan began. Jack thought he could get away with it, I said, speaking for the first time since the formal presentations began. He thought I was too old, too confused, too grateful to question what he was doing with my money. Jack finally looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time since I'd entered the room. Mom, I never meant for it to happen this way. The trust? Management fees barely covered the time I was spending on your affairs. The other expenditures. They seemed reasonable at the time. Reasonable? I felt my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. You told me I was a burden you could barely afford while you were spending my money on luxury cars and family vacations. You allowed your wife to abuse me while you lived in comfort funded by my inheritance. Margaret never, Jack started. Margaret pushed me down and left me bleeding on your living room floor, I said flatly. She told me everyone was waiting for me to die. She tried to have me declared incompetent so you could continue stealing from me without interference. The silence that followed was deafening. Brennan made notes on his legal pad, probably calculating how much worse Jack's situation had just become with this documented admission of spousal abuse. What do you want? Jack asked finally. I looked at this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, this stranger who had betrayed every value I'd tried to instill in him, and felt something inside me finally let go. I want my money back. All of it, with interest. I want you to resign as trustee immediately. I want you to stay away from me unless I specifically invite contact. And I want you to understand that the mother who would have forgiven anything, who would have sacrificed everything for your happiness, is gone forever. Mom, please. I'm not finished. My voice was steady now, stronger than it had been in years. I want my grandchildren to know the truth about why I'm no longer living with you, not your version of the truth, not Margaret's lies about my mental health, the actual truth about what you did and why our relationship has been destroyed. Jack's face crumpled. You can't tell Emma and Michael about this. They're just children. They're old enough to understand that actions have consequences. Old enough to know that stealing is wrong, that abuse is unacceptable, that trust once broken can't be easily repaired. Brennan cleared his throat. Mrs. Green, my client is prepared to make full financial restitution and to transfer all trust assets to your control immediately. He's also willing to formally acknowledge his errors in judgment regarding trust management. What we're hoping to avoid is any public proceedings that might damage his professional reputation or family relationships. His professional reputation? Lucy laughed harshly. He violated his fiduciary duty, stole from his elderly mother, and conspired to have her declared incompetent. His professional reputation should be damaged. Nevertheless, Brennan continued, we believe a private settlement would be preferable for all parties. No, I said quietly. Everyone in the room turned to look at me. No, I repeated. There won't be a private settlement that allows Jack to escape the consequences of what he's done. There will be full restitution, immediate transfer of all assets, and public acknowledgement of his violations. But there won't be any agreement to keep this quiet. Mom, Jack pleaded, think about what you're doing. Think about my career, my family. I am thinking about your family, I said. I'm thinking about Emma and Michael, and what kind of message it sends when someone can steal and abuse and manipulate without facing real consequences. I'm thinking about what Thomas would want me to teach them about integrity and accountability. Robert Chen was smiling now, clearly pleased with how the negotiation was proceeding. My client's position is simple: full restitution, complete asset transfer, and public accountability. Those terms are non-negotiable. The meeting continued for another hour, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Jack's position was legally and morally indefensible, and everyone in the room knew it. By 4 o'clock, we had the framework of an agreement that would restore my financial independence and ensure that Jack faced appropriate consequences for his actions. As we prepared to leave, Jack made one final attempt to reach the mother who had always forgiven him, always put his needs above her own. "Mom, I know I made mistakes, but we're still family. Emma and Michael still need their grandmother. Surely we can find a way to move past this." I stopped at the conference room door and looked back at him, really looked at him, for what I realized would probably be the last time. Family is supposed to protect each other, Jack. Family is supposed to love and support and care for each other. What you and Margaret did to me wasn't family. It was exploitation. And no, we can't move past it, because moving past it would require you to take full responsibility for what you've done, and I don't think you're capable of that. I am taking responsibility. You're accepting a legal settlement because you have no choice. That's not the same thing as taking responsibility. I walked out of that conference room knowing that I was closing the door on more than just a legal dispute. I was ending the relationship with my son, accepting that the little boy I'd loved and raised had become a man I could neither trust nor respect. It was the most painful victory of my life, and the most necessary one. The final confrontation came 3 weeks later, in the most unlikely of settings, Emma's middle school auditorium during her spring choir concert. I hadn't been invited, hadn't even known about the event until Lucy saw it mentioned in the local newspaper's community calendar. But something about seeing my granddaughter's name in print, knowing that her life was continuing without me, made me realize that there were some battles worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. I bought a ticket and arrived early, choosing a seat in the back where I could see Emma, but where Jack and Margaret were unlikely to notice me. The auditorium slowly filled with families, parents clutching flowers and cameras, grandparents beaming with pride. Once I would have been among them, sharing in the joy of watching my granddaughter perform. Emma looked beautiful on stage, her 12-year-old face serious with concentration as the choir prepared for their first song. She had grown. Taller since I'd last seen her properly, her features beginning to show hints of the young woman she would become. Watching her, I felt the full weight of what Jack's betrayal had cost me. Not just money or dignity, but time with the grandchildren I adored. I was so focused on Emma that I didn't notice Jack and Margaret entering the auditorium until they were halfway down the aisle. Margaret spotted me first, her sharp intake of breath audible even from several rows away. She grabbed Jack's arm, pointing in my direction with barely concealed alarm. For a moment, I considered leaving. The last thing I wanted was to create a scene at Emma's concert, to turn what should be a joyful family celebration into another battleground. But then I remembered Thomas's words from his letter. "You are not a burden, Helen. You never were. You are a force of nature who just forgot her own power." I stayed in my seat. The concert was lovely, children's voices blending in songs about friendship and dreams and growing up. Emma had a small solo in the third piece, her clear soprano, voice carrying over the other children with a confidence that reminded me painfully of Jack at that age. I found myself crying, not from sadness, but from a complex mixture of pride and loss and fierce love for this granddaughter who had been turned against me by her parents' lies. During intermission, the inevitable confrontation finally came. Margaret approached my seat with Jack trailing reluctantly behind her, her face a mask of controlled fury. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, keeping her voice low to avoid attracting attention from the other families milling around us. "Watching my granddaughter perform?" I replied calmly. "Your granddaughter?" Margaret's voice rose slightly. "You have no right to be here. You're not part of this family anymore. I'm Emma's grandmother. That's not something you can take away from me, no matter how much you might want to." Jack finally spoke, his voice tired and defeated. "Mom, please, don't make this harder than it already is." "I'm not making anything hard, Jack. I bought a ticket to a public performance. I have every right to be here." "You have no rights when it comes to our children," Margaret snapped. "Not after what you've done to this family." The accusation was so breathtakingly hypocritical that for a moment I was speechless. Then I felt the familiar surge of anger that had become my constant companion over the past month. Not the helpless rage of a victim, but the righteous fury of someone who refused to be gaslighted any longer. "What I've done." I kept my voice low, but let the steel show through. "Margaret, what exactly have I done? Discovered that you were stealing from me? Refused to accept abuse? Demanded to be treated with basic human dignity?" "You destroyed our family," Margaret said, her mask of public civility beginning to slip. "You turned our private business into a public spectacle. You humiliated Jack, damaged his career." "I protected myself from thieves and abusers," I interrupted. "If that destroyed your family, then your family was built on a foundation of lies and exploitation." People were beginning to notice our conversation, heads turning in our direction with the kind of uncomfortable curiosity that public confrontations always generate. Jack, ever the lawyer, tried to defuse the situation. "Mom, let's not do this here. The kids need to see exactly this," I said, standing up so that I was no longer looking up at them from my seat. "They need to understand that actions have consequences, that you can't steal from people and abuse them without eventually being held accountable." "We never abused you," Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You pushed me down and left me bleeding on the floor. You told me everyone was waiting for me to die. You tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could continue stealing my money." I spoke clearly, loudly enough that several nearby families could hear every word. "If that's not abuse, what would you call it?" Margaret's face flushed, red with embarrassment and rage. She glanced around at the other parents who were now openly staring at us, clearly recognizing that her carefully constructed image as the devoted daughter-in-law was crumbling in real time. "You're senile," she said desperately. "You don't know what you're saying. You're confused, paranoid." "I'm the most thoroughly evaluated, competent person in this auditorium," I replied. "I have documentation from 3 independent medical professionals confirming that there's nothing wrong with my mental faculties. The only confusion here is yours. You seem to be confused about what constitutes theft and what constitutes family." The lights dimmed, signaling the end of intermission. Margaret grabbed Jack's arm, clearly desperate to end this public humiliation. "We're not doing this," she said through gritted teeth. "Come on, Jack. Let's get back to our seats." But Jack didn't move. He stood there looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part guilt, part defiance, part something that might have been grief for what we'd lost. "Jack," I said quietly, "I need you to understand something. I didn't destroy our family. You did. The moment you decided to steal from me, the moment you allowed Margaret to abuse me, the moment you chose money over love, that's when our family ended. I never meant for it to happen this way," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of families returning to their seats. "But you did mean for it to happen," I replied. "Maybe not consciously, but every choice you made led us here. Every time you looked the other way while Margaret humiliated me, every time you lied about my finances, every time you made me feel grateful for scraps while you lived in luxury on my money, those were all choices. Mom, I want you to know that I forgive you," I said, and saw his face light up with hope. "I forgive you because holding on to anger would poison the rest of my life, and I won't let you take that from me too. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. Forgiveness doesn't mean I'm going to pretend this didn't happen or trust you ever again." The hope in his face died. "So that's it? We're done?" "We're done," I confirmed. "But Emma and Michael aren't done with me. They're going to grow up, Jack. They're going to have questions about why their grandmother disappeared from their lives. And when they do, I'm going to tell them the truth. The Florida condo was everything Thomas had promised it would be. Bright, airy, overlooking the Gulf of Mexico with windows that filled every room with golden sunlight. As I stood on the balcony, that first morning, watching dolphins play in the waves below, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Lucy had flown down with me to help with the transition, and together we'd spent the past week turning the fully furnished space into something that felt like home. Thomas had thought of everything: comfortable furniture, a well-equipped kitchen, even a small library filled with books he knew I'd love. It was as if he'd been preparing a sanctuary for me, knowing that someday I might need a place to heal. "How does it feel?" Lucy asked, joining me on the balcony with our morning coffee. "Like coming back to life," I said honestly. For 3 years, I felt like I was disappearing, becoming smaller and more invisible every day. Here, I feel like I'm remembering who I actually am. The legal settlement had been finalized the week before. Jack had transferred all trust assets to my direct control, paid full restitution with interest, and resigned from the State Bar Association rather than face disciplinary proceedings. The financial security Thomas had built for me was restored, and with it, the independence he'd always wanted me to have. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was personal. I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, my right to be treated as a complete human being worthy of respect and love. "Any regrets?" Lucy asked. I considered this as I watched a pelican dive for fish in the crystal-clear water. About Jack? About ending that relationship? No. The man I raised, the son I loved, he was already gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize and couldn't trust. All I did was acknowledge the reality that had been there for years. And the grandchildren? That was harder. Emma and Michael were the innocent victims in all of this, caught between parents who had chosen greed over integrity and a grandmother who refused to be abused. I'd written them each a letter, to be opened when they turned 18, explaining everything that had happened and why I'd had to leave. Whether they would understand, whether they would forgive me for not fighting harder to stay in their lives, remained to be seen. "I hope someday they'll understand," I said. But even if they don't, I had to show them that people have worth, that abuse is unacceptable, that love without respect isn't really love at all. Lucy had to return to California the next day, but we'd already made plans for her to visit again soon. She'd become more than just an ally. She was the daughter I'd never had, the family I'd chosen rather than the one I'd been born into. "I'm proud of you," she said, as we sat on the beach that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You could have accepted the situation, lived quietly with their abuse, been grateful for whatever scraps of affection they were willing to give you. Instead, you chose to fight for your dignity." "I chose to remember who I am," I corrected. "Thomas always said I was stronger than I knew. It just took me 78 years to believe him." That night, after Lucy had gone to bed, I sat alone, on the balcony with a glass of wine and a photo of Thomas, finally ready to have the conversation I'd been avoiding for 3 years. "You were right about everything," I told his smiling face. "About Jack, about Margaret, about what would happen to me if I didn't stand up for myself. But you were also right about something else. I am stronger than I knew." The ocean breeze carried away my words, but I felt heard nonetheless. Thomas had given me everything I needed to rebuild my life: the financial resources, the legal protection, and most importantly, the reminder of my own worth. I was 78 years old, and I was just beginning the best chapter of my life. The next few months passed in a blur of new experiences and rediscovered joys. I joined a book club at the local library, started taking watercolor classes, volunteered at a literacy program for adults. I made friends, real friends who valued my thoughts and opinions, who saw me as a complete person rather than a problem to be managed. I traveled, something Thomas and I had always planned to do more of, but never quite found the time for. I visited museums and theaters, took cooking classes, learned to use a computer so I could video chat with Lucy, and research the investments Thomas had left me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living rather than merely existing. The call came on a Tuesday morning in November, 8 months after I'd left California. Lucy's voice was excited, almost breathless. "Helen, you need to sit down. I have news about Jack and Margaret." My heart rate spiked. Despite everything, despite the way our relationship had ended, he was still my son. "What kind of news?" "They're getting divorced. Apparently, Margaret has been having an affair with some banker she met through her volunteer work. She's taking half of everything and moving to Arizona with him." The irony was almost too perfect to be believed. Margaret, who had built her life on manipulating and controlling others, had been manipulated herself. The woman who had stolen my money to fund her lifestyle had been stolen away by someone with more money than Jack could provide. "How is Jack handling it?" I asked. "Not well, according to the rumor mill. He's devastated, apparently completely blindsided. Emma and Michael are staying with him, but he's struggling to manage work and parenting without Margaret." I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for my son, followed immediately by anger at myself for caring. This was the natural consequence of building a life on lies and exploitation. When your foundation is greed and manipulation, you shouldn't be surprised when it crumbles. "The children," I said. "Are they okay?" "I don't know. But Helen, there's something else." Emma has been asking questions. Apparently, she's old enough now to realize that the story her parents told about why you left doesn't quite add up. My granddaughter, the little girl who used to love my bedtime stories, who was now nearly 13 and beginning to think critically about the adults in her life. What kind of questions? She's been asking neighbors, trying to piece together what really happened. She knows about the legal proceedings, knows that money was involved. She's starting to understand that maybe her grandmother wasn't the confused old woman her parents claimed she was. I closed my eyes, imagining Emma, older now, more mature, beginning to see the cracks in her parents' carefully constructed narrative. "Lucy, I need you to do something for me. Anything. I need you to make sure Emma knows how to contact me. Not now, not while she's still a minor living with Jack. But someday, when she's ready, I want her to know that I'm here." 6 months. Later, I was in my garden. Yes, I had a garden now, something I'd never had time for when I was busy taking care of everyone else, when my phone rang with a California number I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "Grandma Helen?" The voice was young, female, uncertain but determined. "It's Emma Green, your granddaughter." My knees nearly gave out. I sank into a nearby chair, my heart pounding so hard I could barely speak. "Emma," I whispered. "Oh, sweetheart." "I'm 18 now," she said in a rush. "I graduated from high school last month. I have my own phone, my own car. Dad doesn't know I'm calling you. How did you get my number?" "Lucy gave it. To me? She said you wanted me to have it, but that I should wait until I was old enough to make my own decisions." Smart Lucy. Wonderful, protective Lucy, who had kept her word and watched over my granddaughter from a distance. "Emma, there's so much I want to tell you." "I know," she interrupted. "I know about the money, about what Dad did. I know about the legal stuff, about why you really left. I've been putting the pieces together for months." We talked for 2 hours that first call. Emma told me about high school, about her plans for college, about the gradual realization that her parents had lied to her about why I'd disappeared from her life. I told her about my new life in Florida, about the peace I'd found, about how much I'd missed her and Michael. I want to come visit you, she said, as our conversation was winding down. I start college in the fall, but I have the whole summer free. Would you want me to come? Emma, I said, tears streaming down my face. There's nothing in this world I would want more. She came in July, staying for 2 weeks that felt like both an eternity and an instant. Seeing her? Again, tall now, beautiful, intelligent, with Thomas's kind eyes and my stubborn chin, was like watching a miracle unfold. We talked about everything. About her childhood memories of me, about the confusion she'd felt when I suddenly disappeared, about the slow realization that her parents' explanation didn't match the loving grandmother she remembered. I'm sorry. I believed them, she said one evening as we sat on the beach watching the sunset. I should have known you would never just abandon us. You were a child, I told her. Children trust their parents to tell them the truth. You had no reason to doubt what they told you. But I should have tried to contact you sooner, Emma. I took her hand, marveling at how grown up it felt. You're here now. That's all that matters. She told me about Michael, who was 15 now and angry at everyone. Their parents for the divorce, me for leaving, the world for being complicated and unfair. He wasn't ready to reach out yet, might never be ready, and I had to accept that. But Emma was here, and that was more than I had dared to hope for. On her last night, as we sat on the balcony sharing a bottle of wine, her first legal drink, she announced proudly, she asked the question I'd been dreading. Grandma, do you hate Dad for what he did? I thought carefully before answering. I hate what he did. I hate that he chose money over love, that he allowed me to be abused, that he lied to you and Michael about why I left. But hate him? No. I feel sorry for him. Sorry? He lost so much more than money when he made those choices. He lost his integrity, his family, his self-respect. He lost the chance to watch his children grow up with a grandmother who adored them. He lost the opportunity to learn from his father's example of how to love someone unconditionally. Emma was quiet for a long time. Do you think he'll ever understand what he threw away? I don't know, but that's not my responsibility anymore. My responsibility is to live the rest of my life with integrity, to show you and Michael, if he ever wants to see it, that it's possible to choose dignity over convenience, love over money, truth over comfortable lies. As I write this, Emma is starting her sophomore year of college. She calls every Sunday, visits whenever she can. She's studying social work, inspired, she says, by my story and Lucy's example to help people who can't help themselves. Michael reached out last Christmas, a tentative email asking if I was okay, if I was happy. It was a small step, but it was something. Maybe someday he'll be ready for more. Jack never remarried. He practices law from a small office now, his career never recovering from the scandal of his disbarment and subsequent reinstatement. Margaret's new marriage lasted less than 2 years before she divorced the banker and moved on to someone else. They deserve each other, I suppose, but I don't spend much time thinking about them anymore. My life is full of new relationships, new experiences, new joys. I travel, I volunteer, I read voraciously and paint terribly and cook elaborate meals. For the friends I've made in this community of people who see age as wisdom rather than weakness. I am 81 years old now, and I have never been happier. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about the woman I was 3 years ago. Broken, defeated, convinced that her life was over and her value had expired. I think about how close I came to disappearing entirely, to accepting that abuse and neglect were the price of having somewhere to live. And then, I think about Thomas's letter, about Lucy's fierce friendship, about the strength I found when I finally stopped, apologizing for existing and started demanding to be treated with dignity. I think about Emma, about the young woman she's becoming, about the values she's learning from watching her grandmother refuse to be anyone's victim. And I think about all the other women my age who might be living in shadows, who might have forgotten their own worth, who might need someone to remind them that it's never too late to reclaim your power. My name is Helen Green. I am 81 years old, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the best years of your life are the ones you never expected to have, the ones that come after you've lost everything you thought you needed and discovered everything you actually are. I was beaten by my daughter-in-law with no one watching, or so she thought. But she fared much worse than I did in the end, because I learned something she never will. That true strength isn't the ability to hurt others. It's the courage to protect yourself, the wisdom to know your worth, and the grace to build a better life from the ashes of what others tried to destroy. And that lesson has made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.